So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan here again, and this is another episode of Backroads Arizona. In this video, I'm going to be adding some USB outlets to my 2007 Weekend Warrior toy hauler. So the reason I added these USB outlets is so we can charge our phones and electronic devices without having to fire up the generator. I personally am a big fan of not wanting to listen to the generator unless we absolutely need it. And this way we can charge all those electronic devices without having to start up the generator. Now, yes, I could have just got some cigarette lighter adapters to USB for the same reason, but this has a much cleaner look to it. Plus, these are permanently attached to the trailer, so there's no chance of possibly forgetting to bring those adapters or possibly losing them. Now, the reason I'm having to add these to my toy hauler is obviously because it did not come with any, because it is a 2007 and kind of pre-USB getting popular. All you need in order to install one of these USB outlets is a 12-volt positive and a ground from the battery on the unit. The easiest place to grab power and ground is usually at one of the auxiliary power points or old school cigarette lighter adapters that come on almost all older RV, camper, or toy haulers. And I'm going to show you how easy they are to install. So let's get to it. So right here, I'm just removing the square drive screws that were holding the cigarette lighter adapter in place in the wall. I carefully pulled the outlet away from the wall, just touching the plastic, because at this point I still had my battery switch on, because I wanted to check my battery voltage behind that outlet to make sure I had a good 12-volt supply and ground. I set my multimeter on DC volts and checked the two wires going to that cigarette lighter outlet. I was getting a reading of 13.5 volts, telling me I had a good power and ground going to that socket. Once verifying that, then I went underneath and shut my battery switch off and disconnected my extension cord that was putting the charging voltage to that socket, which is why it was up at 13.5 volts. Because you really don't want to be wiring this stuff in with positive voltage to that outlet. Then I went in and verified with the multimeter one more time that I had no voltage going to that, so it was safe to wire it in. I disconnected the two wires going to that auxiliary power outlet so I could hook into those to run the USB outlet. Make sure you verify what color wire you took off of each location of that power outlet, because the center pole in the back of that power outlet is your positive, and the wire that's connected to kind of the outer perimeter of that socket is going to be your ground. You can also take your multimeter and test those wires. If you get a negative when you're checking voltage, that means you're reversed. If you don't get the negative sign in front of your voltage on your meter, then you are testing it correctly, which is also telling you which wire would be positive and which would be negative so you can hook it up correctly. So right here, I just held the USB port up in position so I could mark it with a pencil so I knew where I needed to cut out. Make sure you either look in or reach through where your auxiliary power point was to make sure there's not a stud between that hole and the hole where you're planning on mounting the USB port. You also want to verify that there's no other wiring behind there or plumbing before cutting that hole. The USB outlet can be mounted either vertically or horizontally. On this one, I went horizontally. That was before I looked at the cover that goes on it and realized that my letters were not going to be facing straight up and down. So this was a little bit of a mistake on my behalf. I used my multi-purpose oscillating tool to cut out the wall in my toy hauler for that USB power point. I start out by going on the small side with the hole, because I can always go bigger, but once you're too big, you're screwed. The pigtails on the USB outlet were a little on the short side, and I did have to get a couple wires and butt connect them to the USB outlet to extend them to make it easier to hook up to the cigarette lighter. And then fed those wires over from the hole that I cut for the USB over to the auxiliary power point hole. Put the two screws in for that USB outlet and then snap the cover into place. I cut off the female spade connector on the main power wire that was going to the center pole on the auxiliary power outlet, then cut the red wire going to the USB power point, twisted those wires together and put a new female spade connector on it and crimped it together, and connected it back to the spade connector going to the center of the back of the auxiliary power outlet. Then I cut the female spade connector off of the white wire that was going to the outer perimeter of that power point, stripped it back, stripped my black wire coming from the USB power point, twisted those wires together, and then crimped on a new female spade connector onto that. and then connected it to the spade connector going to the outer perimeter of that auxiliary power point outlet. When removing and installing those spade connectors onto that auxiliary power point, make sure you are careful. When I was trying to remove the ground wire from the power outlet up in the master bedroom, the whole connection was coming off, and I had to hold that with a pair of pliers while trying to remove the spade connector so it didn't pull out of the power point. Once plugging both of those spades back in, then I went ahead and put that auxiliary power point outlet back in place, put the screws back in it, went and turned on my battery switch, and checked to make sure that my phone was charging. One other thing when doing electrical work, I highly recommend getting a good pair of crimpers. In the field I'm in, I've seen plenty of crimps come apart and had to rewire those because somebody just didn't have a good enough wire crimper, and those connections have come loose over time. You'll notice these ones have a nice wide crimping surface. They're also a nice long handle, which gives you good leverage to make a good solid crimp, and it has the little dimple to make sure that it squeezes that wire down really well. The only difference in the one that I did up in the master bedroom was I did mount the USB outlet vertically instead of horizontally, and that way the words on the cover were going the right direction. Besides that, everything else was identical. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and it gave you some good information. If so, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. The whole concept of my channel is to give you guys the most information in the least amount of time as possible so I don't waste your time. And I hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Later.